My name is Meredith Cross. I am 34 years old, and I have spent 11 years working property crimes for the Kerr County Sheriff's Office, which means I have spent 11 years learning that people lie the same way they always have, badly, and usually to the people who love them most. But here's what none of them knew: not my father, not my mother, not my brother standing behind him with his arms crossed like a bailiff. I had already watched the footage 4 times before that meeting at the county recorder's office ever got scheduled. I knew exactly what my father had done at 2:47 in the morning, in the alley behind my own rental property, wearing his gray Carhartt jacket and carrying a crowbar he'd owned since I was in the 3rd grade. I just hadn't told him I knew yet. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where the quietest person in the room always has the longest memory. If you've ever had to build a case against someone who taught you how to ride a bike, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. To explain how I ended up standing in a fluorescent-lit government office in Kerrville, Texas, holding a thumb drive that would end my father's freedom the way he had tried to end my finances, I have to go back to the beginning, to a duplex on Barnett Street, to a hardware store that used to smell like cut lumber and WD-40, and to a man I loved for 33 years before I learned exactly what he was capable of. The backstory. I grew up in Kerrville the way a lot of people in the Texas Hill Country grow up: church on Sunday, Friday night football under lights you could see from 3 streets over, and a father who worked with his hands and expected everyone around him to respect that. Donovan Fitch ran Fitch Hardware and Feed on Sidney Baker Street for 31 years. It was the kind of store where the floor creaked in the same 3 places no matter how many times he had it fixed, where the register still rang with a little bell, and where every rancher within 20 miles of the Guadalupe River knew him by his first name. I loved that store the way you love a place that raised you alongside your parents. I used to sit on a stool behind the counter doing my math homework while he weighed out nails by the pound for Old Man Pruitt, who never once in my memory bought fewer than 4 different kinds of fencing wire. My father smelled like cedar shavings and engine grease, and when I was small, I thought that smell was what safety smelled like. He was not an easy man. He believed hard work solved everything and that complaining about anything solved nothing, and both of those beliefs made him difficult to argue with and harder to disappoint. When I told him at 17 that I wanted to go into law enforcement instead of taking over bookkeeping at the store, he didn't yell. He just went quiet for 3 days, which with my father was always worse than yelling. Then, on the 4th day, he drove me to the community college in Kerrville himself, walked me into the criminal justice program office, and told the woman at the desk that his daughter was going to be the best cadet the county academy had ever graduated. That was Donovan Fitch, a man who could make you feel like you disappointed him and championed you in the same week. I should tell you about my mother here too, because she is not a footnote in this story, even though for a long time she stood quietly in the background of it. Linda Fitch taught 3rd grade at Tom Moore Elementary for 26 years before she retired, and she has the particular patience of a woman who has spent her whole career explaining the same fraction 3 different ways until it finally lands. She was the one who noticed when I was falling behind on sleep during academy training and started leaving containers of chicken and rice in my refrigerator without saying a word about it, just quietly restocking whenever she came by. She was the one who sat with me in the hospital waiting room the night I got hurt on a domestic call in my 2nd year of patrol, holding my hand and not asking a single question until the doctor came out to tell us I'd be fine. I want you to understand, going into the rest of this story, that my mother was never someone I doubted. What happened to her trust in my father is its own kind of casualty in all of this, and I think about it more than people probably expect. Fitch Hardware and Feed sat on the corner of Sidney Baker and Barnett, 2 blocks from the duplex I would eventually buy without my father ever quite connecting the 2 locations in his head, though I've wondered since whether some part of him chose not to. The store had a hand-painted sign that my grandfather commissioned back in the 60s, faded gold letters on green, and a bell over the door that announced every customer the same way it had for 3 decades. My father knew which ranchers needed credit until their cattle sold in the fall, and he extended it without ever writing anything down, because he said a ledger in his head was more honest than one on paper, a philosophy that, looking back, should have told me something about how he understood the difference between honesty and convenience. I put myself through the academy working nights at a diner on Water Street called the Copper Spoon, where the regulars tipped in quarters and the owner, a woman named Dottie Ransom who'd been slinging chicken fried steak since Reagan was president, let me study behind the counter during the slow hours between 9 and midnight. I graduated the academy at 22. I made detective at 29, which in a department the size of Kerr County's is not nothing. It means the sheriff trusts you with cases that actually matter, cases with real evidence and real consequences, not just paperwork. Somewhere in those years, while I was working my way up through patrol and then into investigations, I started saving. Not the way people save for a vacation. The way you save when you've decided, quietly and without telling anyone, that you are going to own something with your name on it that nobody can take away from you. I ate at the Copper Spoon on my days off because Dottie still gave me the employee discount even after I stopped working there. I drove a Corolla with 210,000 miles on it long after I could have afforded something better. I skipped the department Christmas party 3 years running because it fell on my overtime shift and overtime paid better than eggnog. By the time I was 31, I had enough for a down payment on a duplex on Barnett Street, 4 blocks from the river, with a hackberry tree in the front yard that dropped sticky little berries all over the porch every August. It needed work, the kind of work you do yourself on weekends with a borrowed sander and a lot of patience, but it was mine. I rented out one side to a young couple, Tyler and Priya Nakamura, who worked at the medical center, and I kept the other side empty for a while, thinking I might move in myself someday. That duplex was the first thing in my life that existed because of nobody's decision but mine. My father offered to help manage it. He said it made sense, he was retired by then, the hardware store having closed 2 years earlier when the big home improvement chain opened off Highway 27 and quietly bled his customer base dry over 18 months. He had time. He knew contractors. He could handle small repairs and collect rent when I was working a case that kept me out past dark. I said yes because he was my father, and because I did not yet understand what it costs a proud man to lose the one thing that told him who he was. The villain introduced. I want to be honest about what I believed at the time. I believed my father was simply trying to stay useful. That is the version of this story I told myself for almost a year, and it is the version I want you to understand, because it is the version that makes what happened next feel less like a betrayal and more like a slow unraveling. Donovan Fitch, in those early months of managing the duplex, was exactly the man I had always known, capable, a little gruff, generous with his time in a way he was never generous with his words. He fixed a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink on the Nakamura side without being asked twice. He replaced a rotted porch board and didn't charge me for the lumber. He showed up on a Saturday morning with a load of pea gravel for the drainage ditch along the side yard because he said the water was pooling wrong and he didn't like it, working through the morning heat in his same gray Carhartt jacket with the sleeves pushed up, the smell of cut grass and diesel drifting off the borrowed spreader he'd rented from a friend rather than pay to rent from the store that had put him out of business. I used to bring him a glass of tea on those Saturday mornings and sit on the porch steps while he worked, listening to him talk about ranchers he still ran into at the feed co-op who asked when he was reopening, as if a corporation with 40 employees and a parking lot the size of a football field could simply be waited out. He always answered them the same way, one of these days, in a voice that had started, sometime around his second year of retirement, to sound less like a joke and more like a man trying to convince himself of something. I didn't clock the difference at the time. I clock it now, looking back, the way you clock things in an interview transcript only after you already know how the story ends. My mother, Linda Fitch, used to say that my father loved people by fixing things for them, because he had never learned another way to say it out loud. I believed that. I still believe it, actually. It's just that a man who has spent 31 years being the person everyone in town depends on does not adjust easily to being nobody in particular, and closing that hardware store had done something to him that none of us, including him, fully understood yet. He started asking about the rental income more than I thought was normal. Not in a suspicious way, in the way a man asks when he's doing math in his head he doesn't want you to see. What's Tyler and Priya paying you these days? You carrying insurance on both sides or just the one? You ever think about refinancing while the rates are decent? I answered honestly because I had no reason not to. I was proud of that duplex. I liked talking about it. I didn't yet understand that pride, shared carelessly, is just information handed to someone who might need it more than you think. The red flags. The first thing that should have told me something was wrong was small enough that I filed it away and didn't look at it again for months, which, if you've ever worked a case that started with something small, you know is exactly how these things go. It was a Tuesday in March. I stopped by the duplex to drop off a new smoke detector for the Nakamura's side, and I noticed my father's truck parked in the side yard even though it wasn't a day he'd mentioned doing any work. When I asked him about it later that week over dinner at my parents' house on Legion Drive, he said he'd been checking the gutters after a storm. I didn't think much of it. Gutters get checked. That's what property managers do. The second thing happened in April. Priya mentioned, in the easy way you mention things to a landlord you like, that my father had asked her a few questions about what was inside their side of the duplex, just making conversation, she said, about what appliances they'd brought with them, what was worth insuring separately, whether they kept anything valuable in the house. I remember thinking it was a strange thing for him to ask a tenant instead of me, but I told myself he was just being thorough. Property managers are supposed to know what's inside a property. That's the job. The third thing was the insurance policy itself. In May, I got a notice in the mail from my carrier, a company out of San Antonio, informing me that my policy had been updated to reflect a change in the listed contents value, a change I hadn't requested. When I called to ask about it, the representative told me the update had come through with my authorization, submitted by phone, using my policy number and the last 4 digits of my social security number. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, feeling something in my stomach that I recognized from work but had never felt about my own life, the particular unease of a detail that doesn't add up yet, but will. I told myself it was a clerical error. I want to be honest about that, because it's the part that's hard to admit. I had the training to see this pattern the moment it started forming, and I looked away from it anyway, because the alternative was believing something about my father that I did not want to believe. I have interviewed 100 people who looked away from evidence sitting right in front of them because the truth was too expensive. I became one of them for about 6 weeks that spring, and I think about that more than I think about almost anything else in this story. The fourth thing was harder to ignore. In June, my brother Chase, 29, between jobs the way he'd been between jobs for most of his 20s, still living with our parents on Legion Drive, mentioned to me at a family dinner, almost as a joke, that Dad had been stressed about money again. When I asked what he meant, Chase backpedaled fast, the way people do when they've said more than they were supposed to. Nothing, forget it. You know how he gets since the store closed. I did know how he got. I just didn't yet know what he'd decided to do about it. There was a fifth thing, and I've never told anyone about it until now, not even Grace. In early June, I stopped by the duplex unannounced on a Sunday afternoon, still in my off-duty clothes, meaning to water the crepe myrtle I'd planted along the fence line. My father's truck wasn't there, but I found the side door to the empty unit unlocked, which struck me as odd since I always kept it locked between tenants. Inside, the smell was wrong before I even understood why, not the closed-up mustiness of an empty house, but something sharper underneath it, like fresh paint thinner, though nothing had been painted. I walked through slowly, professional habit taking over before I even realized I'd switched into it, and noticed the window latch on the alley-facing window had been removed and reinstalled, the screw holes slightly larger than factory spec, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you'd spent 11 years noticing exactly that kind of thing. I remember standing in that empty room with my hand on the windowsill, feeling the wrongness of it in my chest before my mind had assembled the words for what it meant, and then telling myself, out loud, in an empty house, that I was overthinking it. That my father was a handyman doing handyman things. That not everything unusual is evidence of something. I have repeated variations of that sentence to 100 witnesses over the years who didn't want to believe what was standing right in front of them. That June afternoon, I became one of them. There was also the matter of the storage unit. My father had rented a small unit off Highway 173, 10 by 10, sometime in late spring, I only learned this because my mother mentioned it in passing, assuming I already knew, saying something about him keeping some of his tools out there since the garage got so full. When I asked him about it directly at a 4th of July cookout at my parents' house, standing near the grill with the smell of charcoal and lighter fluid thick in the evening air, he waved it off with the easy confidence that had always made him difficult to press. Just tools, Mare. A man needs somewhere to put his tools. I let it go, the way I'd let everything else go that spring, and it wasn't until much later, after everything came apart, that I understood some of what had passed through that storage unit on its way to becoming evidence against him. Here's a truth I've learned working cases for 11 years, and it applies as much to families as it does to fraud rings. Nobody asks you to hand over your life all at once. They ask for one hallway at a time. My father wasn't planning some elaborate scheme from the beginning. I don't believe that, and I don't think it would be fair to tell it that way. I think a proud man who had lost the thing that made him feel like somebody found himself standing in his daughter's rental property, doing small honest repairs, and somewhere in those months, the math in his head stopped being about gutters and started being about desperation. In late June, the Nakamuras gave notice. Tyler had gotten a residency placement in Houston, and they were moving at the end of July. That left one side of the duplex empty for the first time in almost 2 years, and it left my father, for reasons I understand now and did not understand then, alone in a house with nobody watching but the walls. I want to pause here and tell you about a moment that still sits with me, because the honesty rules of a story like this require it. In early July, before I knew anything for certain, I sat in my car outside my parents' house for almost 20 minutes without going in, because some part of me, not the detective part, just the daughter part, already suspected something and did not want to know what it was. I almost turned around and drove home without saying a word to anyone. I want you to understand that moment, because it is the moment right before everything changed, and it is the moment I think about when people tell me I handled this whole thing calmly. I did not feel calm. I felt like I was about to lose my father twice, once to whatever he'd done, and once to the fact that I was the kind of person who was going to find out. The discovery. The break-in happened on the night of July 14th, at the Barnett Street duplex, on the vacant side that had been the Nakamura's unit. I found out about it the way most homeowners find out about a break-in, a call from my father at 6:40 the next morning, his voice doing a performance of shock that, looking back, was just a half-step too smooth. Meredith, somebody broke into the rental. Whole sides tore up. I already called it in. I drove over before I'd even finished my coffee. The scene, when I got there, told a story that any first-year patrol officer would have accepted without blinking. A window on the side facing the alley had been forced open, the frame splintered in a way consistent with a pry tool. Inside, drawers were pulled out of the kitchen cabinets and left hanging open. A television that I did not remember being particularly valuable, an old 32-inch set the Nakamuras had left behind, that I'd been meaning to donate, was gone. So was a portable generator I kept in the utility closet for storm season, and, according to the inventory my father had already prepared by the time I arrived, several $100s worth of tools he said he'd been storing there for convenience. It looked like a burglary. I want to be fair about that. If I had walked into that scene as a detective assigned to someone else's case, I might have written it up exactly the way my father wanted it written up, at least at first glance. But I am not someone else's detective. I am mine. And 8 months earlier, after a string of car break-ins 2 streets over on Clay Street, I had installed 2 discrete security cameras on the duplex myself, one covering the front porch and street, one covering the side yard and alley entrance, the exact spot where that window had supposedly been forced. I had never mentioned the alley camera to my father. It wasn't a secret exactly. It just hadn't come up, the way a lot of things about my own property had simply never come up between us, because I had spent a lifetime being the daughter who didn't need managing. I didn't say anything about the camera that morning. I filed the report the way any homeowner would, gave my statement to the responding deputy, a young officer named Reyes who I'd trained myself 2 years earlier, and drove home. Then I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop, pulled the footage from the cloud storage, and watched the alley camera from the night of July 13th into the early hours of July 14th. At 2:47 a.m., a truck pulled into the alley behind the duplex. Not a stranger's truck. My father's truck, the same faded blue Ford F-150 I had ridden into 100 Little League games, the same one with the dent in the tailgate from a hailstorm in 2019. The headlights went dark before the truck fully stopped, the way headlights go dark when someone doesn't want to be noticed. A figure got out, moved to the side window with what the footage clearly showed was a crowbar, his crowbar, the one I'd watched him use on that porch board months earlier, and pried the window open from the outside, in a single practiced motion, in under 90 seconds. I want to be honest about what I did next, because it's the hardest part of this story to admit. I watched that footage 4 times. And somewhere around the third viewing, I found myself hoping, in the stupid, useless way you hope for things you already know aren't true, that I was wrong about who was in that frame. I paused it on his face, lit for half a second by a streetlight at the end of the alley, and I sat at my kitchen table and cried, not loudly, not for long, but I wanted on the record that I am not made of stone, and that this part hurt in a way that 11 years of casework had never prepared me for. I have interviewed murderers with more composure than I had that night, staring at my own father's face on my own laptop screen. Then I did what I have trained myself to do for 11 years when a case gets personal enough to cloud judgment. I stopped feeling it, and I started working it. I exported the footage in its original format, preserved the metadata, and made 3 separate backup copies, one on an external drive I keep in a lockbox at the sheriff's office, one in cloud storage under a login only I know, and one on a drive I mailed to myself, still sealed, postmarked, the way you do when you've learned in this job that a chain of custody only means something if you can prove nobody touched it in between. 2 days later, I got a call from an insurance fraud investigator named Ron Castellano, working the claim my father had filed, not on my behalf, but using a limited authorization form he'd apparently signed himself, listing himself as property manager with authority to file on my policy. The claim listed the television, the generator, the tools, and, this is the detail that still catches in my throat when I tell it, a designer watch that had never existed, valued at $11,000, that my father claimed had been stored in a lockbox in the rental for safekeeping. $11,000. That was the number that turned this from a strange family incident into something with an actual name. Insurance fraud in Texas, above a certain dollar threshold, is a felony. If you've ever had to weigh loyalty against the truth sitting right in front of you, tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. Quiet preparation. I did not confront my father that week. I did not confront him the week after that, either. I want to explain why, because I know some of you watching this are the kind of people who would have driven straight to Legion Drive and put that laptop on the kitchen table before the coffee finished brewing, and I understand that instinct completely. I simply do not work that way, in this job or in my life. The first thing I did was call Grace Tillman. Grace is a real estate attorney who has practiced in Kerr County for almost 30 years, silver streaked hair always pulled back, reading glasses on a beaded chain she never seems to actually use, and a habit of listening to an entire story without interrupting once, which after a career of interviewing suspects who interrupt you constantly, I have come to find almost holy. I had worked with Grace on property matters twice before, once for the duplex closing itself. I trusted her the way you trust someone who has never once told you what you wanted to hear instead of what was true. I sat in her office on Water Street, 2 doors down from what used to be the Copper Spoon before Dottie retired, and I told her everything. The footage. The forged authorization. The $11,000 watch that never existed. Grace listened without writing anything down until I was finished, and then she took off her glasses, the ones on the chain, and set them on the desk between us. Meredith, she said, you already know what this is. You knew what it was before you called me. The question isn't whether this is fraud. The question is what kind of daughter you want to be standing on the other side of it. That is the line that gave me permission to move forward, and I want to be honest that I needed it. Not permission from the law, I already had that. Permission from someone outside my own family who could look at what I was about to do and tell me it was still a decent thing to do it. Over the following 3 weeks, I did the quiet work that nobody sees in a case like this and that television never shows you. I filed a formal statement with Ron Castellano at the insurance company, providing the footage through proper channels rather than confronting my father with it directly, which Grace advised strongly against. She said if I showed him what I had before there was a paper trail protecting it, I risked him destroying evidence, pressuring my mother into a story, or worse, disappearing the truck that had been sitting in that footage. I requested a certified copy of the fraudulent authorization form from the insurance company's records department, matching the signature against a dozen documents I had at home with my father's actual handwriting, hardware store invoices, birthday cards, the title transfer paperwork from when he'd given me my first car. Grace herself, working separately, submitted a formal notice on my behalf disputing the authorization and requesting the claim be frozen pending investigation. During those 3 weeks, I also spent an evening with Dottie Ransom, my old boss from the Copper Spoon, who still lives 2 streets over from the diner she sold 6 years ago and still knows more about this town than the county newspaper does. I hadn't planned to tell her anything. I stopped by to drop off a jar of her sister's peach preserves that my mother had asked me to deliver, but Dottie has a way of reading a person's face over a kitchen table, the same way she used to read which regulars needed their coffee refilled before they asked. She poured 2 glasses of sweet tea, set them down without a word, and waited. I ended up telling her almost everything, sitting at her kitchen table with the ceiling fan turning slow overhead and the smell of her fried okra still hanging in the air from dinner. She didn't tell me what to do. She just said, "Honey, you've spent your whole life being the one who tells the truth even when it costs her something. Don't stop now on account of whose truth it is." I drove home that night with that sentence sitting in my chest like something solid. I also spent time preparing myself for what this would do to my mother, because Grace had warned me, correctly, that whatever happened at that meeting would land on Linda Fitch the hardest of anyone in the room, harder even than it landed on my father. I called my mother twice that August, just to talk, just to hear her voice on ordinary things, a Sunday school lesson she was planning, a recipe she wanted to try for the church potluck, because some part of me understood I might be about to take something from her that she couldn't get back, and I wanted her to have a few more ordinary conversations with her daughter before that happened. I want to tell you about a night in early August, because this is one of the moments I promised to be honest about, the moments where I almost gave up. I sat in my car outside my parents' house again, just like that morning in July, except this time I had everything I needed in a folder on the passenger seat, and I still could not make myself go inside. I thought about just letting the insurance company handle it quietly, letting Ron Castellano's investigation run its course without my fingerprints on any of it, letting my father face consequences that came from a stranger instead of from me. I sat there for almost 40 minutes with my hand on the door handle, the dome light off, the cicadas loud enough through the closed windows that I could hear them over my own breathing. What stopped me from driving away wasn't anger. It was the memory of that alley camera, and the $11,000 watch, and the fact that if I let this slide quietly, my father would learn exactly the wrong lesson, that the daughter he raised to tell the truth for a living would look away from it when the truth was his. I called my mother instead of going in that night. I told her, gently, that I needed to talk to both of them about something serious, and that I wanted to do it somewhere with a record, somewhere official. I did not tell her what. She asked if everything was all right, and I told her, in the flattest voice I could manage, that I needed her and Dad to meet me at the county recorder's office the following Thursday to go over some paperwork related to the duplex. I let her believe it was about the insurance claim being processed. In a way, it was. My mother, Linda Fitch, is not a villain in this story, though she stood beside one for longer than she should have. I want to be fair to her, because fairness is something I owe everyone in this account, including the people who disappointed me. She has spent 36 years married to a proud man, and pride like my father's asks the people who love it to look away from things, over and over, until looking away becomes a habit indistinguishable from loyalty. When I asked her to come to that meeting, she agreed without asking why, because that is what 36 years of marriage to Donovan Fitch had trained her to do. My brother Chase came too, though I hadn't invited him directly. My father brought him, I found out later, because Dad wanted backup, a witness on his side, someone to make the room feel like it belonged to him. I think, in his mind, if there was going to be a confrontation about the rental property, he wanted it to look like a fair fight, 2 against 2, family against family. He had no idea what I was bringing with me. Subscribe, you'll want to see how this one lands. The confrontation. The Kirk County Recorder's office sits inside the County Courthouse Annex on Earl Garrett Street, a squat brick building with fluorescent lighting that makes everyone under it look a little bit guilty, whether they are or not. It smells like old paper and cold coffee from the break room down the hall, and underneath that, faintly, the mineral smell of the air conditioning fighting a losing battle against the hill country heat outside. The counter is manned most days by a clerk named Bonnie Ashworth, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses of her own and a stamp that thuds against documents with a sound I have always found strangely satisfying, the sound of something becoming permanent. I had sat across that same counter from Bonnie 2 years earlier, signing the closing documents on the duplex itself, my hands unsteady with the particular joy of buying something with money I'd earned one overtime shift at a time. It did not escape me, walking back in that August afternoon, that the same room that had once held the best paperwork day of my life was about to hold one of the hardest. I arrived 10 minutes early with Grace Tillman beside me, carrying a slim leather folder that contained everything: the certified copy of the forged authorization, a printed comparison of the signatures with an affidavit from a handwriting examiner Grace had used before, the insurance company's written confirmation that the claim was under active fraud review, and a sealed USB drive containing the footage, time-stamped and notarized as an unaltered copy by the sheriff's office evidence. Technician, a young man named Perez who I'd worked with for 6 years and who, when I asked him to process it through proper channels instead of doing it myself, said only, "Copy that, detective," and never asked me a single question about why. My father arrived at exactly 2 o'clock, my mother beside him in a blue dress she wore to church, my brother trailing a step behind with his hands in his pockets, already looking like he wanted to be somewhere else. My father was wearing the same gray Carhartt jacket from the footage, which I don't think was intentional, but which struck me as almost unbearably on the nose when I saw it. "Meredith," he said, "what's all this about?" "Your mother said something about the insurance paperwork." I did not raise my voice. If anything, I lowered it, the voice I use in an interview room when I already know the answer and I'm only asking the question to let the other person hear themselves say it out loud. "It is about the insurance paperwork," I said. "I need you to walk me through the claim you filed on my policy. The one listing you as property manager. The one with the watch." I watched something shift behind his eyes, not guilt exactly, not yet. Calculation. My father has spent his whole life being the smartest man in most rooms he walked into, and I could see him trying to find the version of this conversation where that was still true. "That watch was in the unit," he said. "I told you that. Somebody broke in and took it." "There was no watch, Dad." Flat. Handoff report flat, the voice nurses use passing a patient at shift change, no adjectives in it, just the facts in the order they happened. "There's never been a watch. I've lived in and out of that duplex for 2 years. I know every item that's ever been inside it." My mother's hand found my father's sleeve. "Donovan," she said quietly, and I heard in that single word 36 years of a woman asking her husband to be careful without ever quite asking him to be honest. "You think I'd lie to an insurance company?" His voice climbed, the way voices climb when the ground underneath them has started to give. "After 31 years running an honest business in this town, you think I'd?" "I don't think it," I said. "I have it on camera." That is the line where the room changed. Bonnie Ashworth, behind the counter, had been half-listening the way clerks in small county offices always half-listen, but at camera her hands went still over her keyboard. My brother Chase took half a step backward, the way you step back from something that's about to get hot. My mother's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life, not shock exactly, more like a held breath finally being let go, as if some part of her had been waiting 2 months for someone else to say out loud what she already suspected. Grace Tillman set the folder on the counter and opened it with the unhurried calm of a woman who has done this 100 times and knows that speed is the enemy of credibility. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "I'm going to lay out what we have, and then you're going to have a choice about how the rest of this afternoon goes." That was the quiet exit I offered him, the moral permission I'd promised myself I would extend before anything became public in a way that couldn't be undone. You can walk into Ron Castellano's office tomorrow morning and withdraw the claim yourself, in writing, before this becomes a matter for the district attorney. Or we can proceed the way the law requires us to proceed from here. He didn't take it. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's the part of this story that still makes something ache behind my ribs even now. I gave my father a way out, in that office, in front of witnesses who would never have known the difference if he'd simply said yes. And he looked at me, at his own daughter, standing there with 11 years of training and a lifetime of loving him, and he said, "This is exactly like you, Meredith. Always trying to make everybody else look small so you can feel important." That's when I opened the folder the rest of the way. The affidavit from the handwriting examiner went on the counter first, the comparison pages laid out side by side, his real signature from a dozen documents, and the signature on the authorization form that Ron Castellano's office had flagged as inconsistent before I'd even called them. Then the certified letter from the insurance company confirming the claim was frozen and under fraud review. And then, last, I nodded to Grace, who slid a laptop from her bag, opened it on the recorder's office counter in front of Bonnie Ashworth, my mother, my brother, and my father, and pressed play on 11 seconds of footage timestamped 2:47 a.m., July 14th. Nobody in that room said anything while it played. You could hear the air conditioning cycling on in the ceiling vents, and somewhere down the hall, the copier in the county clerk's office finishing a job with a long mechanical sigh. My father's truck, headlights dying as it rolled to a stop. The figure getting out. The crowbar. The window giving way in under 90 seconds, the way it had been giving way under that same crowbar in that same hand for 30 years on things that actually belonged to him. My mother made a sound I had never heard her make before, low in her throat, and put her hand over her mouth. Chase looked at the floor. Bonnie Ashworth, behind the counter, had stopped pretending not to watch entirely, her stamp resting untouched beside her keyboard. My father did not yell. I want to be fair to him even here, in the worst moment of this story, because it matters to me that this account stays honest. He went quiet the way he'd gone quiet when I told him at 17 I wasn't taking over the store, except this silence didn't have anything championing on the other side of it. He looked, for just a moment, like a much older man than the one who'd walked in 10 minutes earlier, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost every bit of the certainty it started with. "I lost the store," he said, "to nobody in particular, or maybe to all of us. 29 years old when I opened it, and I ran it for 31, and then some corporation puts up a building off the highway and it's gone in 18 months. I couldn't," he stopped. Started again. I couldn't be the man who lost everything twice. First the store. Then the one thing I still had left, which was being useful to my own family. I let that sit in the room for a moment, because it deserved to. It didn't change what he'd done. It didn't undo the crowbar or the watch that never existed or the forged signature Bonnie Ashworth had just watched laid out on her own counter. But it was true, and true things deserve a moment even when they don't earn forgiveness. "I understand that, Dad," I said, still flat, still quiet. "I understand it more than you think I do. But you didn't lose the store today. You committed a felony against your own daughter, and you did it in a house I paid for by working nights at a diner so you'd never have to know how close I came to not affording my first car payment. Those are two different things, and I am not going to let you collapse them into one." Villain collapse. What happened next happened quickly, in the way these things always do once the paper is finally on the table instead of in a drawer. Grace formally notified Bonnie Ashworth's office that the meeting was being documented for the record, standard procedure when fraud allegations are disclosed on county premises, she explained later, though I think she also knew exactly what it would do to have a government clerk quietly making notes while my father tried to find his footing. My father asked, in a voice that had gone smaller than I had heard from him since I was a child, whether there was still a way to fix this quietly. Grace told him, not unkindly, that quietly had stopped being an option the moment he filed a fraudulent claim with a state-regulated insurance carrier, that some doors, once you walk through them, don't open back up the way you left them. Ron Castellano's investigation, which had already been underway before that afternoon, moved forward on its own timeline over the following weeks, informed but not driven by what happened at the recorder's office. My father was charged with insurance fraud and criminal mischief for the staged damage to the property, the second charge because, as it turned out, some of what looked like burglary damage inside the unit had actually been deliberately caused, not by an intruder taking what he wanted, but by a man trying to make an empty apartment look ransacked enough to be believable. My mother did not defend him in the district attorney's office the way she had defended him for 36 years at kitchen tables and church potlucks and every argument in between. I don't know exactly what changed in her between that afternoon at the recorder's office and the day she gave her own statement 3 weeks later, and I have never asked her directly, because some things a daughter doesn't need spelled out to understand. I think watching that footage broke something loose in her that she had been holding in place for a very long time, and I think, in a strange way, it was almost a relief to her, the relief of finally being allowed to stop pretending. If this hit close to home, share it with someone who needs it. Aftermath. My father pleaded guilty 11 weeks later to a reduced charge of insurance fraud, avoiding a trial in exchange for restitution and probation rather than the felony conviction and potential prison time the original charges carried. He was ordered to pay back the portion of the claim that had already been processed, $4,200 for the television and generator, which the insurance company had paid out before Castellano's investigation flagged the remaining $11,000 watch claim as fabricated and froze the rest. He was also ordered to complete 18 months of probation and pay a fine of $2,500 to the county. I did not attend the sentencing. Grace advised me it wasn't necessary, and I found, when the day actually came, that I didn't want to watch it happen in a room that wasn't mine to stand in. I heard about it from my mother instead, in a phone call 2 days later, her voice steady in a way I hadn't heard from her in months. The duplex on Barnett Street is fully rented again now, both sides, to a young family and a graduate student from Schreiner University. I installed a third camera, covering the interior hallway between units, not because I don't trust my tenants, but because I have learned, in the most painful way a person can learn something, that trust and verification are not opposites, they are how you protect the people and places you actually care about. My father and I speak now, occasionally, at family gatherings my mother still insists on hosting. It is not the relationship it used to be, and I don't think it ever will be again, and I have made a kind of peace with that. He apologized to me exactly once, in the parking lot outside my parents' church, 4 months after the sentencing, and I believed him, which surprised me more than it should have. Believing someone is sorry and trusting them again are two different things, and I have learned to let them stay separate. Chase, my brother, moved out of my parents' house that fall and got steady work with a landscaping company on the east side of town. I don't think what happened to our father was the only reason, but I think watching it happen made him decide he didn't want to keep standing in rooms where things like that could occur without him saying anything. He calls me now more than he ever used to, usually about nothing in particular, a truck he's thinking about buying, a girl he's been seeing from Ingram, and I've come to understand those calls as his own quiet way of rebuilding something between us that the recorder's office nearly cost him too. Ron Castellano closed his file on the case a little over a month after my father's sentencing, and he called me himself to let me know, which I understood wasn't standard procedure but which I appreciated more than I told him at the time. He said, in the plain way career adjusters talk about the worst parts of their job, that most fraud cases he worked never got resolved this cleanly, because most families don't have someone inside them willing to do what I did. I told him it wasn't willingness so much as training, but I think we both knew that wasn't entirely true. Bonnie Ashworth, the clerk at the recorder's office, still stamps my paperwork every time I come in for something related to the duplex, and she has never once mentioned that Thursday afternoon out loud, though I catch her looking at me sometimes with something that isn't quite pity and isn't quite respect, something more like recognition, the look one person gives another when they've watched them do a hard thing correctly. Grace Tillman sent me a card that December, handwritten, which she told me later she does for exactly one client a year, the one whose case she can't stop thinking about after it's closed. It said, simply, that she hoped I was taking care of myself the way I'd taken care of everyone else in that room. I keep it in the drawer of my kitchen table, underneath the folder that still holds a copy of everything, because some documents you keep not because you'll ever need them again, but because they remind you of who you were willing to be when it mattered. Final lesson. I have spent 11 years building cases out of small inconsistencies that most people walk past without a second glance, a timestamp that doesn't match a story, a signature that leans half a degree wrong, a truck in a driveway on a night nobody asked about. What I learned that summer is that the hardest cases were never the strangers. The hardest case I ever built was against a man who taught me to ride a bike in the gravel lot behind his hardware store, and the evidence that broke it open wasn't clever. It was just a camera that happened to be pointed the right way, and a daughter who finally let herself look at what it showed her. Evidence does not argue. It does not negotiate. It just sits on the table until someone is brave enough to read it. Outro. If this story meant something to you, drop a comment and let me know which part hit hardest. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and I'll see you in the next one.